All right, hello everyone. Welcome to this webinar exploring the causal connection between open air quality data and cleaner air. My name is Krista Hazencope, and I'm the director of the Clean Air Program at the Energy Policy Institute at the University of Chicago, EPIC for short. I'm especially excited for this webinar and hearing more about Professor La Nauze's research on this topic, because this is a topic near and dear to our work at EPIC. From our work with the Air Quality Life Index, we estimate air pollution is taking off more years of human life expectancy than HIV/AIDS or malaria combined. And just earlier this month, the most recent Global Burden of Disease report came out, and it puts particulate matter pollution as the #1 risk factor for human disease. In the Clean Air Program here at EPIC, we believe that if you want to address this global air pollution crisis, a critical first step is making data available where it currently isn't, especially when that data is not available yet at the countrywide level. And to this end, we're building out some new work to help understand and support local actors closing air quality data gaps. Before we dive into Professor La Nauze's presentation, my EPIC colleague Farah Kazi will share some brief updates about our work. Over to you, Farah.
Thank you, Krista. I'd like to welcome all participants who have joined us here today. Good day to everyone. I'll start with, I'll start with the EPIC report, which underscored the critical need for accessible air quality data. This report garnered significant attention and, more importantly, laid the foundation for the EPIC Air Quality Awards, which I'll come to in a second. I'd like to briefly share the different sections of this report. The first one highlights the importance of continuous and long-term air quality data for cleaner air. The second section identified countries with the largest opportunities. This was calculated using an opportunity score, a country-centric metric that estimates the potential for a single, well-supported monitoring effort to have a nationwide impact. You will find the detailed methodology to this in our report. We're dropping the link to the report in the chat. For those of you who are interested in understanding the different metrics and the indicators that we use to come up with this opportunity score. Now that we had identified the countries, we wanted to shed a light on local actors who are well posed to close these gaps. And last but not the least, 4 guiding tenets for philanthropies on how to inject more resources into the space in most effective manner. 4 of these tenets were specifically supporting local ownership and globally shared infrastructure, funding more than just monitors, funding with a long-term view, multi-year wherever possible, and flexibility in the funding support. The EPIC Air Quality Awards recognize individuals and organizations who are working towards improving air quality within their communities and enabling them with the support to continue doing so. Open Philanthropy and AWS made it possible for us to start this first tranche. We're enabling air quality monitoring in 4 countries with high opportunity scores. And we're going to extend the air quality monitoring or tripling the current efforts in some regions by up to 3 times. The EPIC Air Quality Awards were created to enable comprehensive air quality monitoring. Our goal here is to shape the policy level decisions and drive nationwide impact. And consequently, this all impacts public health. Now let's celebrate our awardees. Rodrigo from Argentina for his impactful initiative, Breathe to Change. Terence from Cote d'Ivoire for his contributions to Data 354. Paulson from the Democratic Republic of the Congo for his work with Wasaru. And Sunkaru from the Gambia for his efforts with Permian Health. As we move forward, we are also discussing on establishing the EPIC Air Quality Fund. This fund aims to raise an annual $4 million to $8 million to support the ongoing efforts in air quality monitoring and data sharing. This is not like a perfect number, but something that we aim to begin with to kind of make a dent somewhere in the air quality monitoring landscape. This initiative will provide critical resources to individuals and organizations who are working dedicatedly towards this cause and enable them to influence policy level decisions and drive long-term national level impact. So if there's anyone in the participants who would, whose organizations would like to support the fund that we have started or we are seeking to build, please reach out to our director, Krista Hasenkopf. Thank you.
Thank you, Farah, and congrats again to the EPIC Air Quality awardees. So I'm a big fan of open air quality data, but I don't believe data on its own is going to somehow magically solve air pollution. That said, through my own firsthand experiences and listening to others elsewhere, and through basic intuition, it seems very clear that data is a key ingredient that people will use to battle air pollution when that data exists. Just like people get excited to use data to measure progress towards any type of goal, like someone using a stopwatch to measure how fast they run so they can train to get faster. Sure, some people will never have success, whether that data is available or not. But for a certain set of people, when you make data available where it wasn't before, that lets them measure progress towards something they want to change, they'll use that data to get where they want to go faster. While again, this all seems intuitive, I've never seen anyone quantitatively assess how air quality data availability, specifically in places where there's been little air quality data previously, impacts air quality over time. So it brings me great pleasure to introduce our speaker for this event, Professor Andrea La Nauze. Professor La Nauze is an environmental and energy economist. She's an associate professor in the Department of Economics at Deakin University in Melbourne, Australia. She incorporates insights from behavioral economics into the study of environmental problems. After Andrea presents for the next 20 to 30 minutes, we'll have a short Q&A section that we've curated through questions we've collected from the community by those of you who have registered for the webinar and those who've shared questions via social media. Still, we may have time for one or two questions from the audience, so if you have one, please put it into the Q&A feature in Zoom and we'll see it. All right, Andrea, thank you so much for joining us, and over to you.
Thank you so much. Let me share my screen. I think you should all be able to see this now.
Looks great.
Fantastic. So yeah, thank you so much for having me. As Krista mentioned, I'm coming to you from Melbourne in Australia. And in Australia, often on official or important occasions, we acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands on which we are meeting. And so for me today, I'm coming to you from the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. So again, thanks for having me. This was a really exciting and fun project for me to undertake, in part because I think that air quality is clearly very, very important, in part because in a lot of my research, I actually study the impacts of information, but usually on the behavior of individuals. And then for a final reason, which is that I am a bit of a data nerd. And so trying to understand the impacts of data is also something that I was really interested and excited to explore. So Krista has nicely set the scene, and it probably goes without saying that air pollution, or it doesn't go without saying, because Krista has already pointed out how large a problem air pollution is. So this is actually outdated now. So this is Global Burden of Disease 2019. And part of the reason to start with this picture is not just, it's important to remember the aggregate number of 4 million deaths per year due to air pollution, but also to look at the distribution of those deaths in the world. And so this is a map from the Global Burden of Disease, and you can see that the distribution of mortality from air pollution is clearly not even around the world. In fact, it affects people in some regions and countries more than others. So within that context, it's sort of somewhat surprising that access to air quality monitoring outside of the OECD or outside of wealthier countries has been lacking and continues to be lacking. So here, this is a figure from our paper. So this was published in PNAS. This is the first figure of the paper. And here we take some data from the World Health Organization's air quality database. So this is a database where they track the availability of air quality information across the world. And there's been several iterations of that database. And it's a rough estimate, but it's still, we believed it was still instructive. So on the x-axis here, you can see time, and on the y-axis is the share of non-OECD countries that had PM2.5, so this particularly toxic pollutant, that had some sort of public monitoring, so some sort of government monitoring system. And if we just focus on the black dashed line, that's the share of these non-OECD countries over time that had some sort of public monitoring, government-run public monitoring available. And you can see that it's growing over time, so that's great news. But in 2010, for example, if we just fix a year, less than 10% of countries in this sample actually had some form of government monitoring available. Now, it's within that context, of course, that the US embassies started monitoring pollution at a number of sites. So this, the program that I'm going to analyze, it was the rollout of air quality monitors at US diplomatic facilities. So the first one actually was in Beijing in 2008, and gradually there were additions to that monitoring program over time. And just to paint a picture of the scale of this program, you know, by 2019, 2020, the program had around 50 monitors around the world in different locations, many of them existing in countries that didn't have public or accessible monitoring available at the time. So within that context, we were really interested to study to what extent does availability of information and high quality information on air quality actually impact air pollution in the locations that receive these monitors. This monitoring program, the reason why we were aware of it in part is because it received so much coverage. So these are just some newspaper articles that we grabbed at various points in time that were covering the US Embassy Monitor Program, and in particular, some of the really poor air quality days that monitor had picked up. So in Beijing, when the first monitor was installed, there was actually no publicly accessible PM2.5 monitoring, or at least that's our understanding. And so this embassy monitor really entered into a vacuum of information. And you can see that the information that was produced by that monitor garnered a lot of attention internationally and also domestically in Beijing. But it wasn't just Beijing that received one of these monitors, as I said before. So we're interested in evaluating the impact of this program on local air quality in the neighborhood around the embassy where the monitors were installed. So given that some of the coverage of these sensors and the US Embassy Monitor Program really made the claim that the monitors had in part changed the politics of air quality and had led to changes in environmental policy locally, we set out to really try and evaluate that statement. So as I said, a stated aim of the program, at least as the program developed, so around 2015, 2016, a stated aim of the program was to raise awareness of environmental issues locally. I believe initially the aim of the program was to just measure the levels of pollution that US diplomats were exposed to, but that objective evolved over time. So specifically, we want to answer a few questions. So we're researchers and we like to be very clear on the questions that we're trying to answer in any project. And the questions for this project were, first of all, what was the impact of US embassy monitoring on pollution? Did it have an effect on levels of pollution in the cities that received these monitors? Did it also have an impact on the salience or local importance of the issue of pollution or air quality in the cities that received the monitors? And if it did have an impact on air quality, what were the associated reductions in mortality? were they large, and what were the monetized benefits of that reduction in mortality? And similarly, from the US Department of State perspective, were there any financial benefits associated with reductions in hardship pay that the Department of State needs to pay to US diplomats who are posted to locations that have poor air quality? So in order to answer those questions, we collated data from a series of sources. The first was actually data from the program itself. So the US Air Now website contains historical data from all of the monitors in this program. And so we were able to access that data from the publicly available US EPA, I believe it's an EPA website. So we did have some interactions with some embassies because it was unclear exactly when the monitoring had started. So we do supplement this data, checking it with a number of sources to ensure that we're actually able to accurately pinpoint the exact date at which the monitors were installed and started producing data. The second source of data is annual average PM 2.5 for the period before any monitors were installed and during the period in which monitors were being installed. So we get that data from 2001 to 2019, and in part we stop at 2019 just to ensure that we don't have any issues. We don't want to contaminate the sample with the period of COVID. So that's derived from satellite data. We use a number of different sources of this data to ensure that the estimates are robust, but this is the data from Van Donkler et al. Is our preferred data for measuring particulate matter. And I guess what satellite data has really enabled in a setting like this is we are actually able to see changes in pollution over time before pollution was even measured on the ground, which is sort of a novel thing to be able to do. Usually we can't estimate the impacts of monitoring because we don't have any observations of the thing we're trying to measure before monitoring existed. So then we supplement that data with Google search indices for a few terms related to air quality, so particularly air quality, pollution, and AQI. And then our final source of data is actually the hardship pay rates that US diplomats receive for being in postings with conditions that differ from the United States. So those conditions can be for a variety of reasons, and one of the conditions that is a factor in determining this hardship pay is actually air quality. The hardship pay is actually a percentage increase in salary for diplomats. So that's what we're able to observe. We're not actually able to observe the salaries that diplomats in each location are receiving over time, but the actual pay rate, so the percentage increase, is publicly available information, and we collect that from the Department of State. Okay, so to the first source of data. So here what we're doing, hopefully you can see, I know it's a little small, but this is just showing you the rollout of the monitors at diplomatic locations. I'm probably just going to call them embassy monitors, even though some of them are not strictly speaking embassies. So again, on the x-axis, we have time, and on the y-axis, this is just a count. So of the cities, this is just counting the number of cities that have one of these embassy monitors. As I say, the first was installed in Beijing in 2008, followed by a few others within China, and then the program rolled out to a number of other cities in different countries over time. So they say we're going to stop our sample in 2019, and then we're going to exploit the fact that the monitors were installed at different points in time. We call this like a staggered introduction design in econometrics that allows us to compare the impacts of the monitor within this sample of arguably similar cities. So I'll get more into sort of the technical details of the estimation later on, but this is just to show you that we have this nice rollout of cities over time that's going to be useful for us when it comes to evaluating the impacts of that monitoring program on pollution. Okay, so to the methodology. So first of all, I'll try and describe it in words, and then we'll go to some maths, and hopefully I can describe it to you a little more intuitively. So the idea of the methodology is to compare changes in pollution in cities that did receive a US embassy monitor with changes in pollution in other cities, so comparable cities. Here we're just going to focus on non-OECD cities as a set of comparable cities globally. And these comparison cities are either those that didn't get a monitor in the time that we're observing, so before 2019, or they did not yet have a monitor. So for example, if I go back to this figure, it might be that Kathmandu, I was just talking with Krista about Kathmandu before, Kathmandu is going to be a comparison city for an installation of a monitor in Ho Chi Minh and Hanoi, etc. As well as cities that are not in this set of cities, but come from other non-OECD countries, they're also going to form part of our comparison group. So this method is going to account for a number of things. So one of the things it will account for is that there are what we call level differences in pollution across cities. So it may be that Kathmandu just has a higher level of pollution than Hanoi. And the method is going to account for the fact that Kathmandu generally, over the long term, has a much higher level of pollution than Hanoi. I have no idea if that's actually the case or not. So it's going to account for what we call those long run differences in levels of pollution. But not only that, the methodology is also going to account for differences in the growth of pollution across cities. So it may be that Kathmandu has a higher level of pollution, but Hanoi's pollution is growing much faster. And the methodology is going to account for those differences in the path of pollution across those cities that have nothing to do with the installation of a monitor. So basically what we're trying to do is account for any differences and changes in pollution over time that are not to do with the monitor so that we can extract the effect of the monitor. So it's going to account for any sort of longer term differences in growth in pollution across cities. And it's also going to account for what we call common shocks. So for example, an event that affected all of the cities in our sample in the same year, such as a global recession that affects pollution. So the methodology is also going to account for that in trying to estimate the causal effect of the monitors. Okay, so that's my attempt to try and explain in words. To explain in math, this is the regression. This is the regression equation that we're going to try and estimate. And essentially, you can just think of it as a way of trying to explain our outcome variable, which is the PM2.5 concentration at site I, so that's the index, and in year T. So this is going to be annual data. So we're looking at pollution at an annual level. So this alpha is going to account for that long run pollution level at that site. So as I said, that's the level difference between, say, Kathmandu and Hanoi. This gamma T term, this is what's going to account for that common global shock. So say a global recession that impacts pollution levels across all cities in our sample. Then we have this third term, which is this beta interacted or multiplied by time. So this is a term in our equation that's going to account for what we call a city-specific pollution trend. So as I said, it might be the case that Hanoi had a pollution growth rate that was just much faster than Kathmandu, and we don't want that to bias our estimate of the impact of a monitor on pollution when we're comparing pollution in Hanoi or changes in pollution in Hanoi with changes in pollution in Kathmandu. So that's what how we're going to account for that. And then we come to the important bit. So basically our empirical exercise is trying to estimate these little taus, these tau e's. And what this is it basically is going to tell us the number that is associated with this parameter is going to tell us the effect on pollution in year E relative to year MI. So that just means E years after the monitor was installed. So what we're going to do is employ what's called an event study design, and bear with me, this is the most technical I'm going to get, which essentially means that we normalize time to be around the time that the monitor was installed. So we're going to be counting the year 1 impact, the year 2 impact, the year 3 impact, regardless of whether the monitor was installed in 2010, 2012, 2013. So that's what I mean by normalizing time. And then this error term is just anything else that can't be explained by this model of pollution over time. And technically, we're going to have to make some assumptions about this error in order to interpret this tau as the causal impact of monitoring. Okay, so what do we get from estimating this model? Well, we get the dots in this figure, and we also will get a measure of uncertainty around those dots. So on the x-axis here, this is another figure from the paper. What we're plotting is this normalized time variable. So what this is showing you is years relative to monitor installation. So in the year that the monitor was installed, that's year 0, and we count 1 year after, 2 years after, etc. And this is therefore 1 year before, 2 years before, 3 years before, 4 years before, etc. So one way of thinking about the methodology is that here, these are the tau E's that I was mentioning. These are our estimated impact of US Embassy monitoring on air quality in the cities that received a monitor. And you can, so these are our estimates. As I said, the shaded regions are just different measures of the uncertainty around those numbers that we estimate. And what I haven't talked about yet is this left-hand side of the picture. These squares are actually what we call the pre-trends. So as I said before, we have to make some assumptions about that error term in order to be able to interpret these dots, these numbers associated with these dots, so here -5, as the causal impact of a US Embassy monitor in year 3. So the reason why we plot this and why this section of the graph is so important is this suggests that our assumptions are valid. This gives us confidence in the assumptions that we need to make. So this is a sort of a methodology check or a placebo. So basically you can think about each of these dots as estimating the same tau E's, but before the monitor was ever installed. So if you believe our model, then, and you see that actually there was an impact of a monitor in a year before it was installed, you would have to, I guess, throw away the paper. Because what this is showing is that there's no placebo effect of a monitor that didn't exist. So our model does a very good job at predicting the fact or at estimating the fact that before a monitor was installed in any of these cities, the effect was 0, right? There's no difference between the cities that received a monitor and cities that didn't have a monitor or didn't yet have a monitor, according to this model, before a monitor was ever installed. So essentially you can view this as a placebo, and it's one of the key tests of whether this is an appropriate methodology for this setting, and whether the cities that we use as comparison cities to measure these other changes in pollution over time are a good set of cities. So another way of thinking about it is it's possible that US Embassy monitors were just installed in cities where there were about to be other changes in pollution, or where changes in pollution were already occurring that weren't captured by our model. But if that was the case, we would expect to see that these effects are not at 0, that there's some other estimated impact. So this is good news for the methodology. But of course, aside from the methodological confidence, the most important thing is what we see is not only a reduction, but a pretty substantial reduction, and a reduction that's increasing over time, which is something that is quite intuitive when you think about what would the impact of the availability of monitoring be over time. So in addition to these sort of placebo checks, we have a number of other robustness tests, which of course you always have for an academic study. So one thing that I can just focus on is we change the set of cities that we consider in our sample. So on the one hand, this is just a reproduction of the previous estimate where we cut off the figure at year 4. So this is exactly what you saw before, but cut off at year 4. And here what we do is we remove any city from the sample that doesn't have at least 4 years of data post-monitor installation. And so for the comparison of these two things, you can see that the shapes are somewhat different, but relatively similar. So it's not the case, for example, that this trend, this downward trend over time is just coming from a change in which cities we have more data for. So that's one of the robustness checks that we undertake. And then we make some much more conservative assumptions about who are the set of comparison, the most appropriate set of comparison cities. So in particular, we're here in this specification, we're just comparing cities in our sample to other cities within the same country in the same year. So that's a very demanding and conservative specification. We still find a reduction in PM 2.5 over time, but you can see that that reduction is attenuated or smaller than our main estimates. Okay, so that was the first part of the paper, is to show the impacts on air quality. The second part of the paper is first to understand, one potential mechanism for that effect, and then to try and monetize those impacts. So here we use a very similar methodology, but instead of our outcome variable being air quality or pollution, our outcome variable is actually this Google search index. And we do this for a variety of indices. I'm just showing one. This is the main one that we have in the paper. So you can see that Google search index is just a measure of the search intensity for particular terms, and it's available in a wide variety of cities around the world. And so we were able to extract this intensity index, and we can essentially run the same methodology, very similar idea, where we want to compare changes in this search intensity across cities that did or did not have a monitor at any particular point in time. And we see this growth over time, which is, it's interesting that this growth is very similar in pattern to the pattern of reduction in PM 2.5 over time. And then once again, this placebo check, we sort of pass the placebo check. We're not finding sort of spurious relationships before a monitor was installed. So we have evidence that not only did the US Embassy Air Quality Monitoring Program affect pollution, measured PM 2.5 via satellite data, it also has an impact on individual behavior in terms of search intensity for issues around air quality. So then the final part of the paper is really about trying to understand, okay, well, what's the monetary, can we monetize these impacts? And if we were to do so, what would the magnitude of those kinds of impacts be? So we use established methodologies to do this, and this is not an innovation of our paper. We're just applying existing methods to do that. And so for those who are interested, we take a method from Berlin in 2014, which allows us to take the estimated change in particulate matter from our study, which is due to the Embassy Monitor program, and then calculate the reduction in premature mortality associated with that reduction in pollution. So we get data on these component parts from various, reputable sources, which enables us to calculate this mortality impact. Similarly, then we want to monetize that impact. So we use an established methodology in economics, and in particular health economics, which is called the value of a statistical life. And so we take this formula from a paper written by Viscusi et al. In 2017, which allows us to compute this value of statistical life over many, many different countries that have for which there may not be country-specific estimates of this VSL. And so we just take that formula from that paper. We also parameterize based on information from this paper. And then we take this gross national income, which is just a component of this formula from the World Bank. Okay, so the results. So here we have, depending on where we sort of draw the boundary in terms of who we think is impacted by the reduction in pollution in a city. So we can be very conservative and just say, well, the only people impacted by this reduction in pollution live within 1 kilometer of the monitoring site, or they live within 10 kilometers or 20 kilometers, etc. Then we can calculate, the reduction in premature deaths avoided per city based on that assumption and that formula, and we find these numbers. So if we think 10 kilometers is, a fairly reasonable buffer in terms of how big a ring around the embassy are people affected by this reduction in pollution, we find 193 fewer people died because of air quality in these cities per annum. So this is for each city per annum. Then we can monetize that. So, making the assumptions that I from that formula earlier, and this is the per city mortality benefit in US $1 million. I believe it's 2019 dollars. And you can see that for that 10-kilometer buffer, the median city benefits about $77 million. And I should say these particular estimates that they've pulled out here are based on some of the most conservative estimates of the reductions in PM 2.5 from the Embassy Monitor program. And then finally, perhaps more of interest to economists and maybe the Department of State than to a broader audience, we can also estimate the effect of the monitor program on the rate of hardship paid to US diplomats. So this is a very similar methodology to what I've already shown, comparing changes in hardship pay across cities that did have a monitor versus did not or did not yet have a monitor. And you can see that there's a reduction in the hardship pay paid to US diplomats, which somewhat aligns with the reduction in particulate matter, which is what we would expect if particulate matter was actually reducing in these cities over time. So this is one study, and of course there are lots of remaining questions. So one remaining question is really about, can we use this natural experiment of the introduction of these monitors and the accompanying reduction in pollution to do a full economic valuation of air quality and air quality monitoring? So at the moment, what we have are sort of some components of that full valuation, but we would require much richer data in order to do a full economic evaluation of that reduction. We also have some ongoing work looking in particular, so we understand from our existing analysis that there was increased salience of the issue of air quality locally, and what we're currently trying to understand is whether we can identify an effect on the introduction of new environmental policies. But of course, data is challenging in this setting. We require data across many countries at the same time, or similar quality, similar type of data across many countries in order to do that. But it's something that we're working on currently. And then, of course, there are many other things that could be studied. You could study the impacts of air quality monitoring or air quality on things like foreign direct investment. But of course, you would require the data across many countries and many locations, which is a challenge. Okay, I think I'm supposed to leave it there, so I'll leave you with some smiling photos of myself and my co-author Akshaya, who I think is probably still asleep and so not able to join us today.
Thank you so much, Andrea. That was fascinating. As we enter the Q&A part of this webinar, a reminder to the audience that we pull questions we received from you in the registration and on social media for the Q&A, but if you have more questions that have come up during the presentation, please share it via the Q&A function on Zoom. And I know we've already gotten some there. So I think one of the major takeaways for me, in addition to the relationship you derive between the embassy open data and actual air pollution levels, is that the State Department appears to have potentially saved money by putting up these monitors, since there was that post-hardship differential, or that hazard pay colloquially, is lower than it would be if pollution levels were higher in a given city. And then, of course, 300 million people, other people also benefit from that action that was actually taken in the State Department's self-interest. It gives me hope that other entities could be similarly incentivized through self-interest and the greater good to support closing air quality data gaps. So my first question is, I'd be curious, I know you briefly touched on it in your introduction, but what motivated you to do the study specifically? And was it at request of the State Department, or did you work with them formally, or what did that look like?
It was certainly not at request of the State Department. We had a number of conversations with people who were in the air quality monitoring program and, various other people in the Department of State, as I said, to clarify details of the program, and they were very helpful and really interested in the study. So it was a great interaction, but no, it wasn't. It certainly was completely independent research that we undertook, and we understood the results before we even talked to the Department of State. So in fact, if I think hopefully my memory is accurate, but I was actually living in the US a few years ago, and I was working at the University of Pittsburgh. And I think I saw an article, one of the articles I think that I actually posted, where a US diplomat was quoted as basically arguing that they had fundamentally changed environmental conditions by introducing monitors into these locations. And I'm, a passionate empiricist, very interested, obviously, in the area in general, and just thought of it as a bit of a challenge that, okay, well, maybe I could actually identify and test that claim, because there was no data associated with that claim, right? Other than, I guess, the anecdotal stories of how much pollution had become an issue in these locations. And so that's and then I was chatting to Akshaya about it, who I knew had used satellite data before, and he was excited. And yeah, we set out on this journey, which was it's been a really great project. Yeah.
Thanks for sharing that. I think it's always interesting to hear sort of the backstory of how research actually happens, because you read the paper, it's a professional thing, but there's always sort of this personal connection to the question involved in some way.
And I think for me, I came from Australia to Pittsburgh, which, when you look at the rank of cities in terms of PM 2.5 in the United States, Pittsburgh, ranks highly, or has relatively high levels of particulate matter. And for me, just the level of salience of that fact among the community was somewhat of a surprise, because in Australia, air quality hadn't been much of a topic. And so just the idea of the salience of pollution and impacting people's behavior was sort of front of mind.
Thanks for that. And I think I shared with you that one of the most frequent questions we've gotten from a non-economics audience has been like how to really account for how PM 2.5 levels would have been in a city if not for a monitor. And I think in your presentation you broke that down in several different ways. But I wondered if you could speak a little bit to giving us non-economists in the audience a sense of like, is this a common technique? Is this something you had to especially adapt for this particular project, or just to give a sense of that piece?
Yeah, for sure. So it's, as I mentioned, it's called an event study, but it's part of a broader class of models that use this type of variation. So as I said, it was a staggered adoption. So we have different cities at different points in time are receiving a monitor. So that's what we mean by staggered adoption. And it's a very popular technique, especially in recent years. So I actually saw a presentation recently where someone had collected data. I always love data rather than anecdote. And they said that about 25% of papers published in the top 5 economics journals, so the absolute gold standard of publication in economics, we're using this kind of technique. So it's very, very popular and well established. And the development of the technique, the theoretical development of the technique, has also been a very popular area in recent times. So we use a very modern method within event studies to identify these effects. Yeah, so it is very popular, and I understand it can be somewhat confusing. How can you estimate the effect relative to something that never happened? But that's that's what we're always trying to do effectively when we're trying to make causal statements, is to understand what the impact would have been in the absence. And so the methodology, in part, it uses these comparable cities to effectively construct that counterfactual. And as I said, a good test of whether you're doing a good job is to see, do you estimate an impact of an intervention that was never there? And so the pre-treatment, the fact that the pre-treatment estimates are all lined up along zero is really gives us a lot of confidence that our methodology is sound and that we have a good model of what would have happened to pollution over time, and that we're using a good set of comparable cities.
Awesome.
Yeah.
And I think you touched on this a little bit in your presentation. And I know there's limitations for what you can concretely say for what drove what was the actual driving change. Certainly from city to city, it's difficult to say. But I wondered if broadly, if you'd be willing to speculate a little bit about what you think actually drove those lower pollution levels. This was a question, by the way, that's echoed from Roy from the Clean Air Fund, who is also on the call. If you have any sense of it was a different mechanism in different places. It's you mentioned doing work on future work potentially on like the actual policy piece, but yeah, I'm curious your thoughts around that.
Yeah, so I mean, I think the Google search, one way of interpreting the Google search results is that there was this heightened salience, and so perhaps there was therefore political pressure that led to policy or regulatory change. But another way of interpreting those results is also just that, it's kind of, yeah, it caused an increase in searches because it existed and it could be searched. So it may not have been through that causal mechanism. So unfortunately, I think I mentioned many times, it's fabulous to be able to do this sort of almost global study, and to have so many places that did have monitors over time, and that is fantastic feature of the data. On the other hand, to do any sort of mechanism analysis, you do need to observe something consistently across all of these sites, which is very difficult. Particularly, these are locations that don't have any air quality data, so they may not have any other publicly available data on things that we would like to study, in particular things like policy. So we did look at things like, okay, well, could we separately identify if we understood that there was an existing government monitoring program in that location, and what was the difference in the effect in those locations versus others? We weren't able to reach strong conclusions. So we call this sort of heterogeneity analysis. Like, were there different effects of the program in different locations? But unfortunately, once we split the sample, we just lose statistical precision, and we're not able to make solid statements about, okay, well, there's a different effect for countries that have existing monitoring, or a different effect for countries that have different share of their GDP from different industries. It's very hard, unfortunately, to make those claims, but it's certainly an area that we are very interested in. And I think there are actually a number of other papers in economics and certainly in other areas that are trying to understand the kind of interaction between information and regulation, and how different types of real-time data can impact the outcomes of regulation, for example. So it's certainly a very active area.
Thanks for that. And so in figure 2 of your paper, and the one, one of the core ones you show with the decline in PM 2.5 over time, it's like around year 4, you see this fairly sharp decrease. And of course, it keeps going. It makes you very curious what happens in year 7 and 8. But do you have a theory or speculation for why it takes it looks like 4 years or so to start seeing that rapid progress, or what shapes that shape of the graph?
Yeah, again, I mean, there are many hypotheses that we could articulate, and hopefully some of them can be tested. Like, it takes several years to develop policy and introduce new policy to then tackle pollution, right? There's anyone who works in policy understands that it takes many years in order to do that. So that could be, that just it takes a certain amount of time in order to introduce new policies and programs. It could also be that, you need a certain amount of data in order to actually build a case for some sort of change. Or it could be that, again, you need a groundswell of interest or salience. And you saw in the Google search indices that, again, around that year 4 mark, there was a dramatic uptick. So it is very hard to tease out why that would be. And yeah, I think, again, many hypotheses that could be tested in other settings, with better data that perhaps exploits the rollout of monitors within a country. So there's been some fantastic analyses of what happened in China as the particulate matter monitoring of the Chinese government expanded over time and space as well.
Awesome. And I think my last question to you is a lot of the folks in the audience have launched or are considering launching outdoor air quality monitors in their communities, and of course would love to see this sort of impact where they live. And so this includes not so much, obviously, embassy or diplomatic facilities, but nonprofit groups or informal community organizations. So if you were to based on this research, if you were to give them your best guess at a recipe to replicate the success we've seen with the U.S. embassies to someone in our audience, I'm curious, what would you advise them to do? Would it be like a certain number of monitors? Would it be like a certain level of granularity in the geospatial or temporal resolution, et cetera?
Yeah, well, so again, I don't know. And I think they're all fascinating questions. So I think we can think about some of the characteristics of the US Embassy program that were fairly unique. So clearly there was an actor who was providing this information that was very influential. So having, potentially trusted also, although people would argue perhaps not trusted in many of these locations, but nonetheless a very influential person providing and putting their name to this information. And I think the fact that the information was actually probably useful to people in those locations on a daily basis. So it wasn't just occasional information on air quality. It was information that you would say, wake up, and would actually potentially influence your behavior that day. And so you would pay attention to it regularly. So I think perhaps the real-time nature of the information was also really important. But of course, yeah, it's hard to know. I don't know about the number of monitors. So there are some cities, for example, I'm pretty sure Jakarta has 2 of these monitors, but there are very few cities that have more than 1 monitor. And of course, these are regulatory grade monitors, so they're very expensive. I don't know that necessarily would play a big role. And I know that there's a huge amount of interest in studying the impacts of, low cost monitors and sensors around the world. And I'm sure that there are lots of studies right now that are trying to understand that impact.
That's super helpful. And actually just thinking on it, like, it makes me curious, what is the number? If there's already 10 monitors in a city, my intuition would be the additional one isn't going to have as much of an impact. But if there's 2, that doesn't matter.
Well, I think it also depends on whether the impact is just about when there are more monitors, it just has there are more people paying attention to those monitors. There's sort of a groundswell because I think, so I actually have a study looking at the adoption of a particular low-cost sensor in the United States. And we find that there's a lot of adoption that sort of doesn't really add much information to the monitoring network. So the monitors are all going into places where there already are these low-cost monitors. So yeah, in that sense, you would think that kind of you're reaching capacity, but it could also be that because these monitors are owned by the community and by individual actors, that gives them ownership over that data and that issue and empowers them. So yeah, it's hard to disentangle the actual pure information effect of the monitor and the sort of behavioral political effect of the monitor.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating. Well, with that, I want to thank you again, Andrea, Professor La Nauze, for taking the time to chat with us today about your paper and your broader work. And I also want to thank everyone else across the world for joining us wherever you are, whatever time zone you're in, and for listening in. So with that, we'll conclude the webinar. Bye, everyone.
Thank you all very much.